In 1958, Frank Waters was sitting with Hopi elders in northern Arizona, recording a tradition about the end of an age. The final sign was a star, not a familiar star used to mark a season. A blue star that, according to the account, would appear after the signs of the Great Purification had already unfolded. Its appearance would mark the moment when the old world had reached its end and humanity stood before a choice. The description goes further. The star was not meant to be seen by a handful of people standing beneath one particular sky. The account describes it as something witnessed across different lands on the same night. That is an unusually specific image to preserve in an oral tradition, and there is a date in the ancient record that makes it impossible to ignore: 1054. That year, observers in China and the Islamic world recorded an extraordinary new light in the sky. It was bright enough to remain visible for an extended period, and the event is now understood as the supernova that produced the Crab Nebula. 9 centuries later, the Hopi account recorded by Waters contained its own story of a remarkable star. One record comes from the sky, the other comes from memory, and somewhere between those two records is a story that has been repeated for generations. Long before Frank Waters arrived, the Hopi had already built their lives around the movement of the sky. The sun marked the seasons. Its changing position along the horizon helped determine when the agricultural year was moving from one stage to another. Certain people were responsible for watching those movements, returning to established observation points, and comparing the sunrise against the same features of the surrounding landscape year after year. That knowledge did not belong to one observer. It had to survive the observer. A watcher learned what to look for, carried that knowledge forward, and passed it to someone who would continue the work. The same pattern appears in the tradition surrounding the night sky. The Pleiades held an established place in Hopi ceremonial life. The cluster appears in traditions connected with ritual timing, migration, origin, and renewal. The important thing about the Pleiades is its regularity. It returns. Its appearance can be anticipated. A community that watches the sky for generations can learn its movements and attach meaning to them. But the blue star described by Waters was different. It was not part of that predictable cycle. It belonged to the end of the Great Purification. It was the sign that came after the other signs had already unfolded. And according to the account, its appearance would mark the moment when humanity reached the great choice described in the tradition. That makes the blue star less like a calendar marker and more like an event. Something appears, people see it, something changes, and the appearance becomes part of the memory of the world. There is another detail in the account that makes the description even more striking. The star was said to be visible across different lands on the same night. That is a very different kind of celestial observation. A sunrise belongs to a particular horizon. A seasonal star can be watched from a particular region, but a sufficiently bright astronomical event can cross those boundaries completely. People separated by enormous distances can look upward and witness the same phenomenon, and history gives us a real example. In 1054, an extraordinary celestial event appeared in the sky. Chinese observers recorded it, Arab astronomers recorded it. Modern astronomy identifies it as the supernova that produced the Crab Nebula. The event has also been discussed in relation to evidence from the American Southwest. The event itself is not a mystery. What matters is what happens when you place it beside the blue star account. More than 9 centuries separate the two records. The 1054 event belongs to the astronomical record. The blue star account belongs to the Hopi tradition recorded by Waters. And the temptation is obvious. Find similarities and declare that the two must be connected. But that skips the part that actually matters. How would a memory of an event from 1054 have survived into a tradition recorded in 1958? That is the problem worth following, because oral traditions can preserve information for generations, but establishing that a particular tradition preserves a particular historical event requires more than resemblance. There would need to be a chain of evidence, a transmission, a recognizable detail, something that connects the old event to the later account. And that is where the blue star becomes much more interesting, because once you look closely at the 1054 event itself, one fact stands out immediately. It was not an ordinary star appearing among the others. It was something new in the sky. Something bright enough to attract attention across cultures, something that left records far beyond the place where it first appeared. And that brings us to the next part, because if the blue star really does preserve the memory of a celestial event, 1054 is the strongest candidate in this entire story. The question is whether the details actually line up. In 1958, Frank Waters went into northern Arizona and began recording what Hopi elders told him about their history and their understanding of the worlds that came before the present one. He worked with Oswald White Bear Fredericks, and the conversations produced a body of material that Waters later published in his work on Hopi tradition. The story the elders gave him reached far beyond a single prophecy. They described humanity moving through different worlds, each with its own history, until eventually reaching the world people inhabit now. And at the far end of that story was a period called the Great Purification. The elders described signs that would appear in sequence. One event would follow another. The world would move closer to a great transition. Then at the end of the sequence came the sign that would become the most famous part of the account, a blue star. The star was described as the final signal. Its appearance meant that the time of decision had arrived. That single detail gave the story a very different character. The star wasn't floating separately from the rest of the tradition. It belonged to a sequence that had already begun long before it appeared, and the elders who preserved these traditions lived within a culture where watching the sky had practical importance. Sun positions were observed against fixed points in the landscape. Seasonal changes were tracked. Ceremonial timing depended on knowledge passed from one generation to another. The source describes these sun-watching stations as an established responsibility maintained by trained observers. The night sky carried its own traditions. The Pleiades, for example, held a recognized place in Hopi ceremonial life, appearing in traditions connected with timing, migration, origin, and renewal. So the sky wasn't simply something above the villages, it was part of the calendar, part of ceremony, part of memory. And the blue star belonged to that same world of knowledge. Waters recorded another detail that makes the story especially striking. The star was described as something that would be seen by people across different lands on the same night. Imagine the scale of that statement. One light appearing overhead, people separated by enormous distances, looking upward and seeing the same thing. A celestial event becoming a shared experience rather than a local observation. And that description brings us to a date buried deep in the historical record, 1054. That year, an extraordinary new light appeared in the sky. Chinese astronomers recorded it. Observers in the Islamic world recorded it. Modern astronomy identifies the event as a supernova, the explosion associated with what we now call the Crab Nebula. More than 900 years later, Waters was sitting with Hopi elders recording a tradition about a remarkable star. That is where the two records begin to overlap. And from here, the story moves away from Waters himself. Because before we can ask what the blue star meant, we need to understand how closely the Hopi were already watching the heavens. The blue star is where the old account meets the historical sky. In Waters' record, it comes at the end of the Great Purification. The earlier signs have already appeared, and the world has reached the final stage of the sequence. The blue star becomes the last celestial sign before the transition into another world. That is the detail that made the story so powerful. The star is not introduced by itself. It arrives after everything else, and its appearance carries a consequence. The source describes it as something that would be seen across different lands on the same night. Now look at what happened in the sky in 1054. A new celestial object suddenly became visible. Chinese records describe an extraordinary guest star. Islamic astronomical sources also preserved observations of the event, and modern astronomy has identified the remains of that explosion as the Crab Nebula, roughly 6,500 light years away. The event was powerful enough to remain visible for an extended period, and its appearance was recorded far beyond a single local community. That makes the comparison tempting. A remarkable star, seen over enormous distance, recorded by different peoples, and centuries later, a Hopi tradition describing a remarkable star as the final sign. But this is where we have to slow down. The 1054 supernova is a documented astronomical event. The blue star account is a documented part of Waters' published material. What is not documented here is an historical chain connecting the two. There is no surviving statement in the material before us saying that the blue star was the event of 1054. There is no dated Hopi document from 1054 identifying the supernova, and there is no independent record showing that the 1958 account was deliberately preserving that specific event. So the connection remains a possibility people have proposed, not an established identification Purification. But there is another reason the comparison survives. The 1054 event was extraordinary enough to leave traces across different kinds of historical evidence. The Chinese saw it, the Islamic world recorded it, and the American Southwest contains rock art that has been discussed as a possible depiction of the event. That tells us something important about human memory. A sudden change in the sky can become part of a culture's record. People don't need telescopes to recognize that something has appeared where it wasn't before. They simply have to look upward. Then they have to remember what they saw, and that is where the Blue Star story becomes genuinely difficult, because the tradition recorded by Waters was not merely describing an unusual object. It placed that object at the end of a sequence. The star had a role. It marked a moment. It belonged to a story about the transformation of the world. If that tradition was somehow connected to an ancient astronomical event, then somewhere between the original sighting and Waters' 1958 record, the event would have passed through generations of memory and interpretation. That is a very long journey. 9 centuries is enough time for details to change. Names can change. Meanings can shift, events can become symbols, a real occurrence can become part of a much larger story. And the reverse can happen too. A symbolic tradition can later be connected to a real event because the two appear to resemble one another. That is why the 1054 comparison is fascinating without being settled. The match is intriguing, the historical connection is unproven, and the gap between those two statements is exactly where the investigation belongs. There is one more piece of the story that has to be examined before we can reach a conclusion. Prophecy Rock. The site has become closely associated with modern discussions of Hopi prophecy, particularly the image of a divided path and the celestial symbol described in later accounts. If that imagery could be securely dated and shown to preserve the same tradition, it would add another layer to the story. But the dating is not that simple, and that is where the final part begins. Prophecy Rock is where the story becomes physical. The site has become one of the most recognizable locations associated with modern discussions of Hopi prophecy. Later accounts describe a carved scene involving a divided path, figures representing different choices, and a celestial symbol above the scene. But there is a problem with turning that carving into a precise historical timestamp. The source notes that the age of the petroglyph has not been established through a comprehensive published dating study. That means the image can be examined, its interpretation can be discussed, and its connection with Hopi tradition can be described, but its exact age cannot simply be announced as established fact. That leaves us with the material that can actually be followed. Frank Waters recorded the Blue Star account in the 20th century. Hopi traditions contain a long history of celestial observation. The 1054 supernova is independently recorded in historical astronomy, and Prophecy Rock remains part of the landscape through which the prophecy is discussed. Those pieces are real. The connection between all of them is where interpretation begins, and this distinction becomes even more important because Waters' work itself has been debated. He was an independent writer, and later criticism questioned how clearly his published interpretations can be separated from the testimony he received from Hopi informants. That means we should be careful with the strongest versions of the story. We cannot take a later interpretation and place it back into the mouths of the people Waters interviewed. We cannot take a real astronomical event and automatically label it the event described by the Blue Star, and we cannot use the existence of a petroglyph to establish a precise date that has not been demonstrated. But none of that makes the record uninteresting. In fact, it leaves us with a much stranger historical question. How do traditions survive? A celestial event happens, people see it, someone gives it meaning. The memory passes from one generation to another. Centuries later, the original observers are gone, but the story remains. By the time an outsider records it, the story may contain layers accumulated over hundreds of years. That possibility is enough to make the 1054 comparison worth examining, but the evidence stops short of proving that this is what happened. The source itself presents the connection as a hypothesis rather than an established identification. And there is another boundary that matters. Hopi traditions are not simply historical datasets waiting to be mined for predictions. The source notes that Hopi cultural authorities have emphasized that sacred knowledge has its own rules concerning what can be shared and how it should be understood. That changes the way this story should be approached. The goal isn't to force an ancient tradition into a modern scientific. framework. The goal is to understand what was recorded, what survived, and where the evidence becomes uncertain. So where does that leave the blue star? We have a tradition recorded by Frank Waters in 1958. We have descriptions of Hopi celestial knowledge and ceremonial observation. We have a real supernova recorded in 1054. We have a landscape associated with Hopi prophecy. And we have later researchers who noticed similarities between these separate pieces. But we do not have the missing document that would settle the entire question. We do not have a surviving record from 1054 saying, "This is the blue star." We do not have a scientific dating result proving exactly when the prophecy rock carving was made. And we do not have independent evidence establishing that Waters' blue star was intended to identify the 1054 supernova. That leaves the story open. Maybe the blue star was a prophecy about a future event. Maybe an ancient celestial event became embedded in oral tradition and eventually took on a prophetic form. Maybe the similarities are coincidental. The surviving record cannot give us a final answer, but it gives us something more valuable than a manufactured certainty. It gives us a trail that begins with a story recorded in 1958, reaches backward toward an extraordinary night in 1054, and ends with a question that remains unresolved. When people looked into the sky generations ago and saw something they had never seen before, how much of what they witnessed can still survive in the stories told today? That is the part of the record we can still investigate. And the blue star remains there, written down, remembered, and still waiting for an answer.